9 o'clock on an August morning in 1944. Somewhere high above the Italian Alps, the most lethal sound a man could hear was nothing at all. Captain Jack Reynolds sat alone in his cockpit, strapped into 7 tons of American-built steel and armor plate. The machine around him was a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the single heaviest fighter plane flying in the entire war. Right now, 12,000 feet above the Brenner Pass, its massive Pratt & Whitney engine was completely dead. The 4-bladed propeller that normally blurred into invisibility hung motionless in front of the nose. One blade pointed straight up toward 12 o'clock. It looked wrong. Unnatural. Reynolds was diving toward the valley floor at 300 miles per hour. The only sound reaching his ears was wind, a high, thin whistle sliding over the canopy glass. He was terrified. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to restart that engine. A Thunderbolt without power was technically a glider. In reality, though, it was a falling anvil. But Reynolds kept his gloved hand away from the throttle. He pushed the control stick forward, aiming 7 tons of aluminum at the most heavily defended tunnel in all of Europe. He was betting his life on a simple idea. If the enemy can't hear you coming, they can't kill you. To understand why any sane man would kill his engine in the middle of a combat zone, you have to understand the map. The Brenner Pass was the jugular vein of the German war machine in Italy. A narrow valley carved through granite mountains, connecting Austria to the Italian front. Every tank, every artillery shell, every gallon of fuel the Germans needed had to come down through this pass by rail. The Germans knew it. They'd turned the Brenner into a fortress. Every tunnel entrance, every bridge, every rail yard was ringed with flak towers. Batteries of 88-millimeter cannons and quad-mounted 20-millimeter guns threw up a curtain of exploding metal so dense that American pilots called it the zipper. If you tried to fly down that valley with your engine running, the zipper closed on you, and you died. But the flak guns weren't even the real problem. The real problem was the ears. The Germans had installed a network of sound locators throughout the mountains. Primitive acoustic detection equipment. They looked like giant metal trumpets aimed at the sky, sensitive enough to pick up a fighter plane engine from 10 miles away. The moment an American patrol entered the valley, those listening devices caught the rumble. Operators would triangulate the direction and telephone the flak batteries. By the time the American planes actually arrived, German gunners were already in position. Cigarettes stubbed out, fingers on triggers, eyes locked on the exact patch of sky where the Americans would appear. Even worse, the train engineers knew the drill. When air raid sirens wailed, they'd throttle up and drive their locomotives straight into the tunnels. The mountains were solid granite. A train inside one of those tunnels was untouchable. The pilots from the 57th Fighter Group were beyond frustrated. They'd fly hundreds of miles, risk everything, only to arrive just in time to watch the last rail car disappear into darkness. They were fighting ghosts. Captain Jack Reynolds was tired of fighting ghosts. He flew the P-47 Thunderbolt, affectionately known as the Jug because of its milk jug shape. It was the linebacker of American fighters. Not pretty, not graceful, just huge. British Spitfire pilots liked to joke that the Americans had somehow taught a brick to fly. But the Jug had one critical advantage. It was tough. Its 18-cylinder radial engine produced 2,000 horsepower. A genuine beast. But beasts are loud. The P-47 was one of the loudest aircraft in the entire war. You could hear its turbo supercharger screaming from 2 counties away. That noise was getting Reynolds' friends killed. Reynolds spent his nights in the officers' club, staring at warm beer, turning the problem over in his mind. How do you sneak a 7-ton noisy monster past a listening device designed specifically to detect it? The answer came during what should have been a boring patrol. He spotted a hawk hunting in the valley below. The bird didn't flap, didn't announce itself. It just folded its wings back and dropped. Silent, fast, deadly. Reynolds wondered, could a 7-ton airplane do the same thing? He took his plane up for a test flight, far behind Allied lines where prying eyes wouldn't see him. He climbed to 12,000 feet. Then he reached out and pulled the mixture control all the way back to idle cutoff. The engine starved. The massive propeller shuddered once and stopped. The roar vanished. The sensation that followed was sickening. The nose dropped violently. Reynolds felt his stomach slam into the roof of his mouth. The plane wanted to stall, wanted to flip over and spin into the ground. But he fought it, pushed the nose down, trading altitude for airspeed. He discovered the trick. The propeller blades were set to fine pitch for climbing, creating enormous drag when the engine died. Reynolds reached for the propeller control lever and shoved it all the way forward to course setting. The blades twisted, cutting into the wind instead of fighting it. The drag vanished. The heavy jug stabilized into something resembling controlled flight. A 7-ton sled, quiet and fast. He glided for 3 miles. When he reached the bottom of his dive, he slammed the mixture forward and hit the starter. The engine coughed, spit, and roared back to life. It worked. When Reynolds pitched the idea to his commanding officer, though, the colonel didn't see genius. He saw a suicide note. The colonel reminded him that the P-47 had the glide ratio of a crowbar. If the engine didn't restart, which happened frequently with radial engines that cooled too fast, there would be no second chance. You didn't land a P-47 in the mountains without power. You crashed it. The tactic was officially banned. The colonel ordered Reynolds to stick to the manual. Reynolds went back to his tent, furious. He knew the standard approach wasn't working. They were losing planes every week, and the German supply trains kept rolling south. The war didn't care about protocol. In late August, Allied intelligence sent an urgent signal. A reconnaissance plane had spotted a ghost train, a massive transport pulling 30 cars loaded with heavy artillery shells, heading south toward the Gothic Line. If those shells reached German positions, thousands of American infantrymen were going to get torn apart. The train was currently parked inside what pilots had nicknamed the Impossible Tunnel. Carved into a vertical cliff face near the town of Avisio, the entrance was protected by a concrete overhang. To destroy it, you'd have to skip a bomb directly into the mouth of that cave. And naturally, it was guarded by the deadliest flak battery in the sector. 4 quad-mounted 20mm guns positioned right above the tunnel entrance. The colonel studied the map. He knew he couldn't send a full squadron. They'd be slaughtered. He needed someone crazy enough to try something that wasn't in any manual. He called Reynolds into his office. Didn't say much. Just pointed at the map. Told Reynolds the target had to be destroyed. Then he looked out the window and said 6 words. "I don't care how you do it." Reynolds walked out to his plane. The ground crew had already loaded 2 500-pound bombs under the wings. He climbed onto the wing and looked at the massive P-47. It looked like the worst glider in the history of aviation. He strapped in anyway. His wingman, Lieutenant Red Miller, gave him a thumbs up from the next aircraft over. Miller didn't know the full plan. He just knew they were going hunting. They fired up their engines. The noise was deafening, a deep, chest-rattling roar that shook the ground. As Reynolds taxied toward the runway, he looked at the mixture control lever. That little red knob was the difference between life and death. He was about to commit aviation's cardinal sin. He was going to turn off the engine. Reynolds climbed through cloud layers toward the Brenner Pass. At 12,000 feet, the temperature had dropped to 20 below zero. The massive Pratt & Whitney hummed along, drinking gasoline and spitting fire. Lieutenant Miller was tucked in close on his right wing, thinking this was a standard dive-bombing run. Reynolds tapped his radio button, told Miller to stay high, provide top cover. He lied and said he was having engine trouble. The Brenner Pass appeared ahead, a jagged scar cutting through White Mountains. The peaks rose to 10,000 feet on either side, creating a narrow canyon of gray rock and dark pine forest. It was a death trap. Reynolds leveled off at 12,000 feet, 8 miles from the tunnel. This was the point of no return. He glanced at the tachometer. The engine was alive, warm, eager to run. Killing it felt like murdering a friend. He took a deep breath of cold oxygen, reached out with his gloved hand, grabbed the mixture control. He yanked it back to idle cutoff. The engine banged once, a loud backfire, and then quit cold. The nose pitched down. Reynolds fought the stick, forcing the plane into a shallow dive. He grabbed the propeller lever and slammed it to course. The blades twisted. The massive four-bladed fan froze in place. Silence rushed into the cockpit. The roar was gone, replaced by the high-pitched hiss of wind. Reynolds could hear metal spars creaking in the wings, could hear his own breathing. He felt weightless, suspended in a falling cage of aluminum and steel. He pushed the nose down steeper. 300, 320. The flying brick picked up momentum, gravity doing what gravity does best. He was dropping below the mountain peaks now, entering the canyon itself. He scanned the valley floor, and then he saw it. The massive concrete mouth of the Avisio Tunnel at the base of a giant cliff. Guarding it were the flak towers. He could see the gun pits clearly, could see the barrels of the Quad 20 cannons pointing skyward, could even see the gunners themselves. Tiny dots standing around their weapons, looking south, scanning the horizon. They were listening for the roar of engines. They didn't look up, didn't look north. They had no idea that 7 tons of death was gliding toward them from behind in total silence. Reynolds was coming in fast now, over 350, the ground rushing up. Suddenly, a flash of light. High above, a German spotter had caught the glint of sunlight on Reynolds's canopy. The man raised a flare pistol. A bright red ball of fire shot into the sky, but the spotter was confused. He fired single red, aircraft spotted, not double red for attack. He probably thought Reynolds was a damaged German plane limping home. The gunners in the valley saw the flare, turned their heads, started pointing, arguing. They weren't running to their guns. They were hesitating. That hesitation was Reynolds's window. 3 miles out. The tunnel mouth was growing larger. He could see the train, a long black snake of steel cars, half hidden inside the mountain. The last 10 cars were still sticking out, exposed. Then the situation spiraled. The spotter realized his mistake, fired a second flare, then a third. Double red, triple red. Enemy attack. The gunners woke up, scrambled into their seats. The barrels of the Quad 20s swung around. They started firing blindly, putting up a box barrage, a wall of exploding shells directly in front of the tunnel. Reynolds gripped the stick until his knuckles turned white. 2 miles out. He was gliding straight into a curtain of fire. Couldn't pull up, couldn't turn, had no power. He had to fly through the explosions and hope he came out the other side. But because they couldn't hear an engine, they aimed high. They assumed the attacker was coming in a steep power dive from 10,000 feet. They were wrong. Reynolds was sliding in just above the tree line. The heavy P-47 sliced through the air like a razor blade. He was below the barrage. Black puffs of 88mm shells exploded 500 feet above his canopy. Shrapnel rained down on his wings, but the blast waves were above him. He was surfing underneath the curtain of death, 1 mile out. The airspeed was bleeding off, the controls getting mushy. This was the danger zone. He had to time this perfectly. Reynolds focused on the tunnel mouth. He had to skip his bombs like bomber pilots did against ships, drop at a shallow angle so they'd bounce across the surface. He aimed for a spot 50 yards in front of the tunnel entrance. 300 yards. Committed now. His hand hovered over the bomb release lever. 200 yards. He could see rivets on the train cars, could see the stunned expression on a German loader's face as he looked down and saw a 7-ton monster floating toward him at 200 miles per hour. Now. Reynolds yanked the release lever. 2 500-pound bombs dropped from the wings. The P-47 lurched upward. Reynolds fought to keep level, watching the bombs fall away. They hit the ground perfectly. Set with delay fuses, they slammed into the railroad ties, kicked up dust, and skipped. Bounced once, twice, 3 times. Flew through the air like skipped stones and disappeared into the black darkness of the tunnel mouth. Direct hit. But Reynolds didn't wait to see the explosion. He was now 200 feet off the ground, moving at 200 miles per hour, heading straight for a vertical granite cliff face. And his engine was dead. This was the suicide part. He had maybe 3 seconds. Reynolds slammed the mixture control to rich, shoved the throttle forward, hit the starter switch. Nothing happened. The electric starter whined, trying to turn the massive engine over. The prop blades turned slowly, but the engine didn't catch. It was cold. The oil was thick. Reynolds stared at the cliff face filling his windshield. He could see individual cracks in the granite. He was going to die. He screamed into his oxygen mask, pumped the primer, prayed, "Start, you bastard." Then the miracle happened. 1 cylinder fired, a puff of black smoke, then another, then 5. The engine caught with a violent roar. The propeller blurred into motion. Reynolds slammed the prop lever back to fine pitch. The engine screamed. The P-47 woke up. Reynolds stomped on the rudder and yanked the stick into his gut. The heavy fighter groaned. The nose pitched skyward. The belly cleared the top of the flak tower by inches. He went vertical, climbed straight up the cliff face, engine howling at full emergency power. And just as he cleared the canyon lip, the detonation hit. Inside the tunnel, Reynolds's bombs detonated. But they didn't just blow up track. They set off a chain reaction. The train was hauling artillery shells. When Reynolds's bombs went off, they detonated the first car. That car detonated the second. The second detonated the third. The pressure had nowhere to go. The tunnel became a giant cannon barrel. A massive tongue of orange fire shot from the tunnel mouth. The blast wave disintegrated the concrete entrance, picked up train cars, and threw them across the valley like toys. The flak tower was simply erased. The gunners were vaporized instantly. Reynolds, climbing at 3,000 feet, felt the shock wave slap his tail. He looked back. A mushroom cloud of black smoke was billowing higher than the canyon walls. Up above, Lieutenant Miller watched in disbelief. He'd waited for the crash, for the ball of fire. Instead, he saw the mountain explode. Then he saw the silver jug rocketing out of the smoke like a phoenix. Miller keyed his mic, voice shaking. "Good Lord, Jack. You didn't just hit the tunnel, you moved the mountain." Reynolds didn't answer immediately. He was busy calming his shaking hands. He checked his instruments, everything green. He finally keyed his mic. voice dry but steady. "Target destroyed. Let's go home, Red." I think I woke them up. When he landed, the ground crew was waiting. Reynolds climbed out, flight suit soaked with sweat. His knees were weak. He sat on the wing, just breathing. The colonel's jeep screeched to a halt. The colonel walked up. He was the man who'd banned this tactic. Called it suicide. "Well," the colonel asked, "did you survive the physics?" Reynolds lit a cigarette, hand trembling. "Physics worked fine, Colonel. Gravity did most of the work. I just steered." The colonel shook his head. He knew what Reynolds had done was impossible. Defied the manual, defied common sense. But the impossible tunnel was gone. "Don't ever do it again," the colonel said, trying to sound angry but failing. "And good job, Jack. Damn good job." But the story didn't end there. Reynolds had proven the German defenses had a blind spot made of silence. In the mess halls of the 57th Fighter Group, other pilots started asking questions. "How fast do you dive? What's the best prop pitch?" Reynolds grabbed a napkin and started drawing diagrams. He wasn't just telling a war story. He was teaching a class. The Reynolds glide never became standard procedure. Too dangerous. But pilots kept it in their back pocket for impossible targets. In the months that followed, whenever a target was too hot, pilots would climb high, cut their mixtures, and turn into ghosts. The Germans never figured it out. They thought the Americans had developed silent engines. They never guessed the secret was just a crazy pilot reaching for the off switch. Reynolds finished his tour in late 1944. 80 missions. The colonel sent him home before his luck ran out. He didn't come home to parades. He took off the uniform, put on a suit, got a job as an engineer, lived quietly, raised a family. When people asked what he'd done in the war, he usually just said, "I flew fighters." He never mentioned the glide. How do you explain that the most terrifying moment of your life felt like peace? Reynolds died in 1985. He was 68. The funeral was simple. A few gray-haired men from the 57th showed up. They told stories, laughed about bad food and cold tents. Then Miller, his old wingman, stood to give a toast. Voice cracking, he raised a glass of whiskey. "To Jack," Miller said, "the only pilot I ever knew who could shut up long enough to win a war." The P-47 Thunderbolt hangs in museums today, a massive chunk of aluminum and steel. People see power, see the 8 machine guns, read about 2,000 horsepower. They imagine the roar. They don't see the glider. Don't know that on a cold August morning in 1944, that machine did something that defied its own nature, became weightless, became invisible. History is loud, full of explosions and speeches and roaring engines. But sometimes, the most important moments are the quiet ones. Sometimes the hero isn't the one shouting loudest. It's the one who knows when to be silent. Next time you see a P-47, don't just look at the guns. Look at the propeller. Imagine it frozen. Imagine the courage it took to reach out and kill the engine, to trust physics, to fall into the valley of death without making a sound. That's the legacy of Captain Jack Reynolds. That's the sound of victory.